Ladies and gentlemen, let me be the first to welcome you to San Jose, California, where the local time is 10:11 p.m.
Last Wednesday, I flew out to California for the Sea Otter Classic. This is the largest bike festival in the world. Given that the trails in Vermont won't be dry or rideable until late April, this would not only be my maiden voyage on my new bike, but I will also be competing in pro dual slalom and downhill. This would be my first time riding on dirt all year. I was originally planning on live streaming the build, but the day before flying out, I was still waiting on some key parts to arrive.
Ooh, there it is.
You could say the wait was quite suspenseful. I built this bike up lacking many of the right tools, so we had to get creative.
Alright, so normally you would take these two things, put them in a vise, clamp them down, and take a hammer to drive this thing in. Unfortunately, I don't have a vise, and I don't have vise grips. So we're gonna have to get creative.
And like with any build, things never go as planned. Before long, our living room had decayed into a complete mess. Luckily, I had just enough time to get the bike built and packed before catching my flight. This bike is going to be my daily driver, and what you'll see me riding most often. My sponsors, GT Bicycles and Noble Wheels, sent me parts for this build. The rest of the parts, such as drivetrain, brakes, and suspension, were either given to me from friends of the channel, or a few bits and pieces I had left over from previous builds. The frame itself is a GT Force. I'll be calling mine Bruce because it's a brute force machine. The same frame is ridden by the top current Enduro World Series leader, Martin Mays, and the runner-up, Noga Korum. The Force is GT's Enduro frame with 27-inch wheels and 150mm of rear travel. The front triangle is made out of carbon, while the back is made out of aluminum. I'm 5'10", which puts me right on the cusp between a size medium and a size large. I ended up going with a size medium as bikes on the smaller side tend to be more maneuverable. In place of annoying internal cable routing, GT brought back groove tubes. These were first used on many of their bikes in the mid-90s. It keeps the cables readily accessible for maintenance, while still concealing them from the sides to maintain a clean look. As far as suspension goes, this year we're running a Fox 36 fork with 160mm of travel, a Grip 2 damper, 3 volume reducers, and decals that completely clash with the rest of the paint scheme. In the back, I'm running a stock Fox DPX2 shock. I have the flip chip set to the high position, and most importantly, it comes with matching decals. The LTS linkage tuned suspension gives the bike a nice progressive feel. Essentially, the further into the travel, the less leverage the link has to compress the shock. This is what makes the suspension feel progressive right out of the box. When set up right, for most riders, it'll virtually eliminate harsh bottom outs without needing to disassemble the shock and install volume reducers. This is also what makes this bike a great choice for those wanting to run a coil shock. For wheels, I'm running an updated version of Noble's TR38 carbon hoops. Given that I'm not exactly easy on my wheels, going a full year without having to true my previous wheels kind of blew my mind. This year we're pairing the Noble hoops to Onyx hubs. It uses the same Sprag clutch system I've come to love. This gives the hubs an infinite amount of engagement points, and they're dead silent. A nice benefit of a silent hub is being able to hear how my tires are hooking up on the trail, but it also helps me catch any nefarious noises before it becomes too late. When I get back east, I will eventually be installing some form of tire insert, but for the time being, these Minion DHRs with XO casings will work just fine. As far as drivetrain and brakes go, Shimano sent over a full XT kit. I'm running 170mm cranks with a 34-tooth chainring and an 11x42-tooth rear cassette. And while I thought I ordered a 4-piston Shimano XT brakes, I must have accidentally requested the 2-piston versions instead. At moderate speeds, they honestly felt really good, but even with a 200mm rotor in the front, I definitely found myself wanting a bit more power once I got up to speed. In the cockpit, you'll notice a little bit more of a traditional setup. I'm running a 50mm length stem, which helps me weight my front wheel and get more traction in turns. I personally find the older 31.8mm clamp diameter to be completely adequate. If anything, with 785mm wide bars, the extra flex helps smooth out trail vibration and reduces form fatigue. I'm somewhat picky about my lever setup. I like my controls to barely overlap with my grip. This allows me to death grip the bars when things get too rowdy. And then to tighten the cables up, I will use electrical tape. It's a whole lot simpler than using string tube. As far as dropper posts go, I'm currently running the Fox Transfer with 150mm of drop. That's the maximum GT recommends for a size medium frame, though I'll most likely experiment to see if I can get away with a longer post. Now, speaking of seats, while I was at Seattle, the guys at Fabrique noticed my bike. They gave me this really nice and elegant looking saddle which perfectly matched the color scheme of my bike. When I first jumped on the bike, it took a little while to get up to speed. The fork honestly felt really harsh. But that was my fault. I never bothered to check the compression settings. And as it turns out, the compression damping was shipped fully maxed out. Once I dialed those way back, I felt right at home. The rear suspension was also rather tricky to set up. Initially, I set the shock up with 190 psi. I immediately lost 40 psi once I sat on it, and proceeded to reinflate the shock to 190. Once again, the pressure dropped 40 psi. Turns out, you need to cycle the Fox DPX2 up to 10 times to charge the negative air spring. This means having to compress and reinflate the shock to the desired psi and then repeat that process until there is no noticeable drop in air pressure. As a side note, the GT Force works best with less sag compared to other brands. Eventually, I settled on 230 psi to achieve the 12.5 sag that GT recommends. This information can be found in the tech download section of GT's website. So you're probably wondering how the races went. Well, in dual slalom, I found myself struggling quite a bit, especially with the flat turns. But I was still able to qualify for finals. In my first round, I got paired up against a third place qualifier and was quickly eliminated. In downhill, I felt much better, but when it came down to race time, I haven't even touched a stationary, so my legs weren't exactly ready for the finishing sprint. Overall, I'm extremely pleased on how well this bike turned out, and I really enjoyed meeting a lot of awesome fans while at Seattle. If you have any specific questions about this bike and the build, let me know in the comments below. If you want to see my full downhill race run, I'll leave a link to that in the upper right hand corner. As always, thanks for playing bikes with me today, and I'll see you guys soon.
4, 3, 2, 1, go!